I'm honored to be joined by Curt Mills, one of the few people who I think I can describe as a foreign policy expert who's actually deserving of the term. Every time I see that Chiron, it's like Pavlov's dog. I'm like, okay, what country is this person going to call that we need to start bombing? I guess Iran is now maybe a strong contender. But Curt, I'd love to sort of get your thoughts on the development of what President Trump was just talking about in the cold open, that we've apparently stopped bombing the Houthis. They said they didn't want to continue their campaign. Your thoughts, and then we'll get into more broadly the Iran conflict.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, more surprises, more art of the deal. I think all things considered, since the bombing campaign started in mid-March, this was the absolute best case scenario of what could have occurred. Trump accepted the Houthi offer that was extended, sort of informally last month, and it looks like ahead of Trump's trip to the Gulf next week. It's safe for the president, all things considered, in a dangerous part of the world to travel to, and this is a resumption of the sort of work that was going on in the transition when Special Envoy Witkoff negotiated a ceasefire between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and hopefully it all holds.
And just broaden this out. Obviously, there's been a lot of back and forth, perhaps leading to firings and leak investigations and all that jazz over at the Pentagon. That's at least been sort of one of the potential explanations. But where you think we stand on maybe the best way to do it, the sort of factions that you think you've seen emerge, particularly in the never-ending quest to start a war with Iran, where we sort of stand in that horse race right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you said the factions and not necessarily the factions within the administration. I mean, this platform is as important as almost any government cabinet or bureau at this point. So, it's a huge vortex for President Trump's attention. But, the effective battle lines are this. Those who want to take the wars that were inherited from President Biden and resolve them this year in Trump's first 360 days, and those who want to see expansion of the theaters, either whether it be in Ukraine or the Middle East. The Middle East one seems like it's front burner right now. We could have an Iran deal as soon as this month. They're already into technical negotiations, so the negotiations with the Iranians are further along than they have been at any time since the secession of the JCPOA on the American side in 2018. They're further along than they ever were under Biden. And so, I mean, the prospect of a Trump-Iran deal is very live, one that would take the nuclear option for the Iranians off the table for the foreseeable future and, hopefully result in peace in the Middle East. There are those sort of hawkish bush-wing Republicans, the sort of Nikki Haley types, the Pompeo types, the Wall Street Journal types who want to see a new offensive. This is very related to Yemen. They argue that the Houthis are a direct proxy of Iran. It's far more complicated than that. But regardless, it is increasingly set up as a binary. Does President Trump want a new war in the Middle East, or does he want to be a nominee for the Nobel Peace Prize?
I think the jibe we kind of always hear from our audience is, oh, well, with whatever's going on in Ukraine or whatever is maybe potentially, calming down a bit in the Middle East, that they're now looking for their sort of new forever war. Do you think that that's a valid paradigm to evaluate what's going on in Iran through? Or is this sort of, I mean, I would probably think it's a longer drawn out thing. There's been more effort and investments made to make this into a potential forever war type conflict. John Bolton just, comes to mind naturally. But your thoughts on that sort of critique?
Yeah, I mean, look, say what you will for former National Security Advisor Bolton, Ambassador Bolton. He's very honest, and that's what a maximal sort of neocon hawk Republican worldview looks like. It looks like the U.S. overextended and into every theater forever and ever. And he doesn't really make any apologies for that. There's not much nuance there. I think yes, Iran and Ukraine are separate theaters, but the hawks so often sort of link them. They'll say, "Oh, look, the Russians are using Iranian Shahed drones. That's how it's all one fight. The world is breaking up into axis of autocracies versus the Western democracies. This sort of inevitable, unavoidable fight is very redolent, frankly, of the World War I or the pre-World War I environment, where these endless series of alliances tripped us into a huge world war. And that's why I think these sort of alliances, unquestioned, unambiguous, and lockstep, even with some of our closest partners, are should be evaluated and are pretty dangerous.
I see it happen a ton with China, whereby these neocons sort of co-opt the PRC issue, and I think accurately estimate the threat that it is existentially, geopolitically, but then they use that not really to actually take on the CCP, but just to justify the newly minted $1 trillion defense budget. And in some ways, I think you see the bolstering of a lot of these enemies, to justify that continued spending at a exponentially, if not logarithmically, increasing rate. I'd love to get your thoughts on I believe I'm correct, the $1 trillion defense budget, the sort of reorientation, putting more measures and just preparation into the sort of anti-China front. Do you find meaning in that, or do you think that it's, regrettably just sort of, Washington politics as usual, forget who the president is, no matter what, you're going to see defense spending balloon?
Yeah, I mean, look, the budget put forward by OMB, last week was, on the second derivative, positive, but it was still an increase, and yet the sort of hawks on the Hill, very much anchored around the Senate Armed Services Chairman Roger Wicker, complained that it wasn't enough, and so I think it shows that I think oftentimes there's this sort of perspective like, well, we should just it's a big tent, we should try to balance all these factions, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality, I think, is that the neoconservatives and the hawks, it's never enough. I mean, even if the U.S. Were to do a regime change war in Iran, the next thing that would be asked would be to do a regime change war in Turkey. Same thing with the Pentagon budget. If you give them $200 billion more, they'll ask for $500 billion more. I just view it as a far more of a trade-off. As to the China question, rather directly, I think it's always very curious that those who would want to hike the Pentagon budget most prodigiously are often the ones who have long records of wanting to trade with the Chinese openly, right? So, I mean, how rational is this? We're talking about increasing the Pentagon budget for this allegedly existential threat that we need to, sink more and more resources into while the country's industrial capacity sort of withers away. The average American thinks the country's going in the wrong direction. And on the other hand, you can't have any question about the tariff regime or lack thereof on the PRC. I think it's just an entirely failed sort of globalist cast of mind that has been the default architecture of decision makers in Washington since at least the 80s.
Curt Mills, always an honor to have you on. I know the audience loves keeping up to date with your writings, your Twitter. As Steve would say, you're always coming in hot. Where can people go to follow you and keep up to date with everything that you're working on?
For sure. Please help the magazine, theamericanconservative.com. You can subscribe. And then often you can also see my work on X, just at CURTMILLS. I'm out there.
Curt Mills, thank you as always